So this video is on getting OpenVPN Access Server running in Azure and getting it authenticating with Active Directory via LDAP Authentication. The documentation available is really good, so if you go to Resources, Access Server Documentation, and then select the Azure BYOL Appliance Quick Start Guide, you'll get a lot of information to get you running quickly, but let's go through it step by step from within the Azure portal. So to get started, we want to create a virtual network. And I'm going to be using a paid subscription because I can't deploy the Access Server to a free service. So first thing we want to do is we want to create a resource group. And from that resource group, we also want to hang a virtual network. So let's add our virtual network. I'm going to leave mine in the Sydney area, so Australia East. Security, leave the defaults. If you plan on routing between your Azure virtual network and remote networks, just make sure that the address space you choose doesn't overlap with any of the sites. And a lot of Australian commodity modems might use the 000, so just make it something unique. And I'm going to change our default subnet to change its name, and we also need to make it part of the address space we've just configured, so we just modify that. And then we want to create another subnet, and this subnet is just having a separate subnet, but we're going to put a domain controller in there that will address from our VPN clients. So now we have the subnets configured. Let's step through and run the validation, and finally, as soon as it validates, let's create our virtual network. Now that deployment is quite fast, so we can just wait for that to complete, and then we want to then start putting resources into our virtual network. Now the first resource we want to create is our OpenVPN Access Server. Now don't choose something that's not the official access server, so just find the one from OpenVPN and then select the create button for that. Again, we want to choose the resource group we put the virtual network into. We want to give our access server a descriptive name, and we need to change from trusted to standard security type for our image to boot. And if we have a look at recommended by image publisher, we can choose a burstable 1 gig image, and for a small deployment that'll be fine. Now here it's saying SSH public key, and it would generate one for us, but let's just do something slightly different. I'm on Windows 11, but Windows 11 now has, we'll just generate a RSA key, and we give it the default name, and it says enter a passphrase. You'd normally always want to put a passphrase, but I don't want to be entering passwords, so I'm just going to make it empty, and then we can have a look at our keys, and we can see that we've generated our RSA keys. And then we want to have a look at our public key, and we just want to copy that. Now before we move away from this screen, we can add our private key into the SSH agent, so it'll be in memory ready to be passed through to authenticate with our OpenVPN Access Server. So from here we can make changes. We can say, okay, the username is OVPN. I'm going to use an existing public key, and I want to paste that in there. So now I've given my VM the correct authentication details that I've provided. So next step, we go through to our networking tab, and this is the OpenVPN access server, so we want it in that subnet. We want a public IP. The network security group is already pre-configured with all the correct ports open. And then finally, we look at monitoring and we say boot diagnostics. Well, we certainly want to be able to see what the boot screen looks like, so we leave that enabled. And then we choose review and create. And once the validation passes, we just hit create. And again, we just have to wait a few moments for the deployment to complete. Now, while we wait for that deployment to complete, we can also add our domain controller into our compute subnet that we've created. So what I've done to avoid having to do a long configuration with that, I've got a disk image that I've pre-configured. So I'm just going to click on that, and there's, with disks that are unattached, you've got this create VM button. So I'm just going to create a new virtual machine using that disk. And I'm going to call it TGN Domain Controller 1. With domain controllers, you might want a little bit more grunt. So we'll select the 8 gig, 2 vCPUs, standard burstable image. Leave the defaults there. Networking, we just want to make sure it's in the compute subnet. In this case, with this domain controller, we don't need a public IP address. So we're going to remove that because we'll talk to the domain controller through the access server. Monitoring, again, leave boot diagnostics enabled. And finally, we want to create our virtual machine as soon as it validates. So now we have our domain controller coming up in the background, and we're just deploying it right now. Let's go and look at our access server. So we can go to our virtual machines here, the virtual machines tab or pane, and is it ready to connect to? Well, to find out, because we've got boot diagnostics enabled, we can go down to help boot diagnostics and have a look at the screenshot, and we can see that there's a login prompt there ready for us to log in. So now we can log in. We go overview, just get rid of that, and we've got a public IP address here, so we can copy that. Now we know we created a user account. We go, and we created a user account, so we've got OVPN at and just the public IP, and it's going to say, do you want to add that fingerprint? We say yes, and now we're just waiting for it to connect, and it's connected. Now don't press enter straight after you connect, because you'll say no to the agreement. So just wait to see that agreement line and then just say yes to agree, and then say yes, it's the primary access server node. We leave the default of all interfaces being listened on, and then here's where we can make a modernization. So instead of it being RSA for old clients, we can upgrade. So double click, right mouse button on Windows 11, and then just right mouse button to paste. We can upgrade the algorithms for the CA and the web certificates, so to elliptical curve. Now here we have the defaults, and we could leave that and everything would work perfectly, but we're going to customize our admin web port. So we're just going to make that 50443. We want to leave the OpenVPN daemon running on the TC port at 443 because that allows the most clients to connect, because it's the same port that your secure browser connects through. So it will be the most likely to be open. So leave it at that. We may or may not want to route all our traffic through the VPN, but I'm going to say no, and the same for DNS. And here it's picked up that the access server is on this subnet, and it's saying, do you want that to be accessible? By default, we say yes, and then you say, do you wish to log in as admin UI as OpenVPN? And yes. So here we have a need now for, I'm just going to open up my document here, and I'm going to use a password that I've created and copy it, and so I don't have to keep re-entering it. So I just copy the password and right mouse button, and then copy right mouse button again. So that is a completed end user license agreement, the wizard, and with the activation key we say no, we're going to do it later, just enter blank. Now once it's gone through its initialization, it will give us two URLs to make it connectable by and from a browser. So we've got two there. Just a word of warning, and what can you do if things go wrong? I was copying and pasting this password into the Linux shell, but just a word of warning. Notice what happens if I put a password in that the shell interprets as commands. So notice that this password, the double dollar, is actually being replaced with the process ID. So if you put something in incorrectly, you will have a password that you don't know, and then you won't be able to get into your admin console. So how do you fix things like that? Well, you can use the commands that are in the OpenVPN access server. There's a bunch of different commands, and you can just go and look at the documentation, and you'll find that there's a command you can reset the super user to local authentication on the access server and reset the password, and finally load those changes. So if you do make a little mistake, you can recover using the command line and get back in. Now what they do recommend is that you do, straight after you install, that you run a sudo apt-get update, which will update the package lists, and then from there they also want you to run an upgrade. So it takes a few moments for all this to to go through, but what we would then do is run an upgrade, and there's like 470 meg of packages. They also recommend if you're going to run time-based one-time passwords, you do also need to install an NTP server. Now I'm not entirely sure in Azure whether the Azure agent keeps the VM in sync time-wise, so this might be just adding something that's not needed, but they do recommend that you put an NTP server in so it can go out and synchronize itself perfectly or close to perfect with the internet time servers. So once you've done that, you've installed NTP, you can see that there's now a little process running that will keep the date and time on your virtual machine in sync with the internet time. So we've now gotten to the point where we can connect to our admin panel here. So here's the URL, so let's copy that, but can we immediately connect? Well, the question is no, because we've got two problems. Firstly, it's given us the private IP address of the VM, and we've made a customization to the port. So let's go and fix those issues. Firstly, we want to copy our public IP address for the access server and pop that in here. And secondly, we want to go down to our networking on our access server and allow that traffic on that port. That's a custom port, it's not the 943 default. So we just want to make a change here and save it. For our network security group, this will allow that port through. Now sometimes that takes a long time, so if I press enter, it may come back to me and say connection refused or connection timed out. Other times it works really quickly and you immediately connect and you get just a security warning. But as you can see, we're just waiting for that to complete. And here it's saying, yes, that's normal. Sometimes it says connection timed out, and then a few seconds later, okay, now it's finally made a connection with an untrusted certificate, so it's going to give you this warning. And then we can just click and continue on. Now the admin user is OpenVPN, and as we remembered, we gave it a password, and I didn't seem to copy that very well, so we'll try that again. And then we're signed in. Now the first thing you're prompted to do is accept the agreement, and the next thing is to get an activation key. So I'm already logged into the OpenVPN website, and I'm going to choose the free 2 connections for free subscription. So just copy that, and where are we? We enter the activation key and choose activate. And now we're ready to configure our access server for its first client connection. So how do we do that? Well, we firstly go to network settings, and we find that the public name or IP is incorrect. It's actually the private IP auto completed there. So what we need to do is grab the public IP address of our VM and put it in. Now we could use a host name and DNS and make that something different, but let's just use the IP address. Then we can see that this is a multi-daemon mode. It's serving on both 443 and 1194. We want that for maximum compatibility. We can see our custom port numbers here, and then finally we just need to click Save Settings and update the running server to apply them. Now this is normal. You'll get a connection refused, and you just have to press Enter again to reconnect and log back in. And I think I've got an IP address in memory, not a password, so we'll just copy and paste our password in. So now we're ready to have our first client connection. So how do we do that? Well, the URL is just this part. So we can pop that in, and we get, and might need to copy our password again, and we have the option to download all the clients. I've already installed the OpenVPN client, so we won't go through that, but once we've got a client installed, and all you do is click on the correct operating system and then install it, you can then get yourself a profile. And that profile, if you click on it and you've got the client installed, it will just pop it up and say okay. And then you can pop in the password, just double check that that's correct, and hit connect. Now what do you get by default? Well, you get what you've configured, which is, let's go to our local client, and you know that the OpenVPN access server is running on that address in the cloud, and so you can immediately ping the OpenVPN access server, because by default we're allowing access. Now let's have a look at another case. This is the domain controller in the other subnet, but clearly it's not communicating. So how do we enable access to another subnet? Well, we go to our portal, and we can do it in a number of different places. We can go into configuration, and we can go VPN settings, and then we can say, okay, we know that the other subnet is this, so we can just put it in there, and it says all clients would be given access. But maybe we don't want that, so we can also go into our user management and user permissions, and just select the user that we want to add a specific permission to and hit save. And notice as we update the running server, notice it just disconnects and reconnects immediately. And then if we go back to our ping, we can see that we've now got connectivity to our domain controller that we brought up. So that means that we can then go to our domain controller and log in. Now I've cached the credentials, so it just logs straight in. But we now have to do a little bit of configuration to get our domain controller ready for the OpenVPN access server to use as an authentication source. So let's do that. So we go into here and we type in users, so Active Directory users and computers app, and then we just fire that up. And by default, if you log into a default instance, you will see just a simplified view, as you can see here. Now, there's a number of different settings that we want in order to set this up, and we're just going to set up the Active Directory now to make it all work. So the first thing we want to do, we could, if we wanted to, get the server to authenticate everything below the top level and anything that's a user it could use. But it's not always good to do that. We might want to compartmentalize things a little. So I'm going to create an organizational unit that is going to house the accounts that I want to allow to connect via OpenVPN. So I'm going to create a user here, OpenVPN 1, and just go and grab a password so that we don't have to type one in. And that's one user created. Let's copy that user. Give it the same password. And we also want, just to demonstrate this ability, we also want to create a group. I'm going to call that group Remote Access. And there's our remote users. Now it also recommends in OpenVPN documentation that we don't bind anonymously, but we bind using a user. So I'm going to go into this OU, which is the default one, and create a user. Call it bind. And now this user, you probably don't want the password to expire for something that's going to be used in the background. So we'll say don't expire, and now we've created a bind user and 2 VPN users. Let's go now to the portal, the OpenVPN portal, and make our OpenVPN access server talk to our domain controller. So you go to authentication, go to LDAP, and then you say, okay, I want to enable the LDAP authentication. Now, what's the IP address? Well, we know if we go into our virtual machines and we refresh, we can see here we've got a public IP address here. If we scroll down a little bit, find our private IP address, and then we want to put that in its primary server. Now, a secondary server, again, you would need, if you had a secondary domain controller, put that address in there. Now, they say use a non-anonymous, so bind it as a proper user. So the password, we know we've set that, is this default password here. So I'm just going to paste that in. But the binding, and how do we get that for our bind user? Now, by default, if we look at properties in Active Directory users computer, there doesn't seem to be anywhere we can find a DN. So to get that, we need to change our view settings to advanced features, everything sort of shows up then. And then we need to go and right mouse button on our user, and then we get an attribute editor, and we can just click in there, hit the D key, and we'll find distinguished name. That's what the DN means, distinguished name. And we want to then paste that in. Now the next thing it's asking for is the base for user entries. So again, we can go back in here, and we could do it right at this top level if we wanted to. Go to the attribute editor, go distinguished name, and say everything below that we can use as a login, but we don't really want that. We want to limit it. So we'll go to the properties of the OU we've created, go to the attribute editor, and we can see the distinguished name there set for that OU. And so we can say there. Now the username attribute is, we can leave that as SAM account name, but if you did want to change that, just have a look at the options you've got. You can go into the attribute editor, and at the moment it's SAM account name, which is simple and nice, but you could use something like the user principal name, which would be more like an email address. Now if you're synchronizing with Office 365 or Microsoft 365, that's very likely going to be a proper internet email address. So you might want to use that as the SAM account name, or the what does it call it? Username attribute. So that's another option. Now finally, if you want to not only have a container where users are allowed to log in from, but also want people to be a member of a group, you can use member of equals, and then we can go back and choose the distinguished name of this particular group. Go to the attribute editor, copy that in, and while we're here, we're just going to make our VPN1 user a member of that remote access group. So we can just apply that, and we go back to our, make sure there's no spaces, and we go back to there. Now you can also, if you put a pipe in, I think, and you've actually got to just put different, you can actually do multiple groups, but you just have to look at the website and find out what the syntax for specifying multiple groups. We're just going to leave it as you've got to be a member of remote access to be able to log in. So let's save that, and remember always to update the running service. Now how do we know that the LDAP authentication is working and it's set up? If we go into authentication settings, if there's a problem, we'll either see LDAP disabled or LDAP in brackets with the word error. So at the moment you can see that it's ready to be selected. So we can change over now to have our default authentication method be the domain controller. So let's test that now by logging in. So we're just going to log out of our user access URL, and we're going to try OpenVPN. Let's try 2 first. We know we set both of their passwords to that. So we try it with 2, and it says no, not having a bar of it. We try with OpenVPN1 and notice that we get our login there. So now we can download a connection profile for our domain controller user and go OK. Pop in our password, just make sure it's correct, and we can now connect as our OpenVPN user off the domain controller, and we're now authenticating off our domain controller. And as you can see, as soon as we do that, we lose connectivity to our other subnet, because that particular user, if we have a look, we go into, apologies, go into user permissions, and then we just have a look at the user. It's added to the database here. we can see that there's no permissions for that user to access that other network. Now we can, let's add ability just to talk to that one host, and let's see if saving that, and we might just update the running server, see it reconnect, and let's see if, yeah, so now with that setting, we've actually, we'll go back in and just show you, might need to, there we go, and we might just need to refresh there. So with that setting there, that's saying just with the 32-bit subnet, it's just saying connect only to that one specific host. So yeah, we got a lot of different options there to make our customizations per user, per group, whatever we'd like. It's just something you have to play with. So now we can see we're connected back to our domain controller. We have Active Directory authentication working well. Now let's do something else that's really going to help to protect our infrastructure, and let's switch over to, for this particular user, let's switch over to time-based, one-time-based multi-factor authentication. So let's do that. So we go enabled for the user, and we can do it per user or per group, but let's just do it for our user and update the running server. And nothing seems to have happened, but let's watch what happens when I try to reconnect this particular user I've changed to one-time password. So it says you must enroll this user in Authenticator first before you're allowed to retrieve a connection profile. Well, let's do that. So we're currently logged in as that user, but let's log out and back in again. OpenVPN 1. I'm not sure if I've got the password in there. We do. Now notice what happens as soon as we've made that change. We now get prompted to register for authentication to an Authenticator app. So that could be Google Authenticator as it says on the screen. I'm going to use Microsoft Authenticator on my phone here. And I'm just going to hit add account, work or school, scan a QR code, and I'm just going to pass it, and I get a new account on my phone, and then we just add the number that comes up on the screen, so 805015, and confirm, and then we're logged back in. So notice that every time now that we have, we'll just make sure I've got that password copied. Every time we log in now, notice it now prompts us for a one-time password. And now we can go back to where our authentication failed, and this time just wait for another 4 seconds, couple of seconds, till a new number comes up, and we go 977270, and now we've got multi-factor authentication working through our OpenVPN access server. So that's really good, because if someone compromises the password, they're still going to get around this. So that's another good aspect of the OpenVPN access server. So now we have one-time passwords being used. So we've done a lot, but let's continue and now make another change. Now, in the access server here, if we go down to configuration, and we have a look at network settings. In fact, I'm wrong. I think it's actually VPN settings. If we have a look at VPN settings, we can see at the moment it says, should VPN clients have access to private subnets? Yes, using NAT. And that's preferred because the client hides behind the access server's address, and everything just seems to work really well. But sometimes NAT does not work with some applications. So you might need to use routing, and it's very different. So what we'll do, we're going to go yes, use routing. So what we've got here, we're pinging our domain controller. I'm going to say yes, use routing, and then we're going to say save settings and update the running server. And has anything changed? Well, notice what happens when we reconnect and we now re-authenticate. And right, so now we're using routing mode and it still seems to work. Now, why is that? Well, that's the difference between global settings and per user settings. So sometimes you've got to pay attention to that. Let's go back into user permissions and we'll make this change, because notice saying use NAT. So you might make a global change, but if there's a user setting, you might need to switch over and say, okay, I'm going to use routing. And then what you'll find, let's reconnect. It's 192.262. And now we're seeing that, yeah, general failure, it's not going to work. Now that's because once we switch over to routing mode, it will not transfer the traffic. There's a number of different problems that we've got to solve in order for traffic to be routed rather than NATed. So the first problem, let's go to our virtual machines, is that our access server is now having to transfer traffic in a different way. So it's actually needs a change in the network interface. So what we're going to do is go to network settings under our access server, and then we're going to go to here, and we need to go to our network interface, there it is, and go to IP configurations. And the first thing we need to do is allow that access server to act as a router. So we need to check this box and click apply. Now something else that you might want to do is make it so that the private IP address isn't dynamic, it's static, but that's something you can sort of do on your own. So we've enabled IP forwarding, but we've still got no access to the subnet behind us because we're missing something else. So we now need to do something at a virtual network level. We need to add a root table. So how do we do that, and what settings do we use? So the first thing we need to do is create our root table, and I'm just going to call it root table 01. And leave the defaults there, go next and create. And as soon as our root table is created, we need to then specify some settings that we want it to have. So notice there that we can't connect to our domain controller, so it's just errored out. Now, what are the settings that we need in order to configure our root table? Well, let's have a look at our configuration, and we want VPN settings, and we've got two settings here that we need to include. We want this network address and this network address to be in our root table. So we'll go into our root table, go to the resource, it's deployed now, and choose to add roots. Here we go. So we want a root name, we're going to call this root 1, and the destination is from our access server. We want firstly, the network address here is that address, and it's a 20 subnet. Yep, and the next hop is an appliance, and the next hop address, if we had a look, it's 1067. It's the private IP of the access server. So that's one route that we need to add. And then the other one we want to add, route 2, is this. So these are the tunnel addresses that are going to be given to clients possibly. So we want to add both of them. And again, this has got the /20. The next hop is virtual appliance again, and then it's 10.67. What was it? 0.4. So once that's added, we now need to associate this route table with the subnets. So we find our virtual network and we say, okay, we've got the Open AS, we want to associate that. So anything on the Open AS subnet will need to talk to the access server in order to talk to the clients. So, and then finally the same again, anything on the compute subnet will need to talk to the access server in order to talk to the VPN clients. Now, has that done anything? Not so much yet. Right, so we just need to stop the ping and restart it. And now we can see that we have now configured our client here. So if we go back to user management and to user permissions, we can see our client is set up for routing, and it can now talk to, once again, it can talk to the domain controller. So we're back being able to access it as well, but this time in routing mode. So there's a lot of different configuration you can do. I'm not fully aware of everything that can be done. The documentation is good, so when you have a question, Google, check the documentation. But this has just been a walkthrough of really getting the access server ready for proper use with a couple of remote clients and with one-time passwords and Active Directory authentication. And I really hope that this has been useful for someone.